So in today's web dev tip, what we're going to do in our project is actually connect our Node application, our Express backend that we've already created, with the Mongo database that we've set up in the previous tutorials. So we're going to do that using this npm package. So there's a Node.js driver, and we simply use this to create our connections from our code to the MongoDB instance, a bit like we did yesterday from the command line, but this time we're going to be doing it in our actual code. So let's go ahead and install this package into our project. So down here on the command line, I can simply paste npm I MongoDB. And once we've done that, all we need to do is just import it into our project, and we need to import a property from the library called Mongo Client, and that's from MongoDB. So let's first of all create our connection string URL. So we'll say the URL is equal to the MongoDB URI, very much like we set up yesterday. So what we need in there is the username, so Mongo admin, and then the password, which was Rick, and then %40 to encode the @ symbol, and then 0LL. And then we say at localhost, so it's 127.0.0.0.1, and then of course the port number, which from our Docker container is 27018. So that's the connection string that we used in the previous tutorial, so that should hopefully work for us here today in our code. And let's just create a new client variable, and that's going to be equal to Mongo client, and then we just pass it in the URL. So we can have multiple databases on our Mongo server. So let's just make sure we've got a database name that we're going to be using. And of course, we'll just keep it the same as the project. We'll say it's rickandroll is the database name. And what I'm going to do here is create a new function, and it will be the connect to database is the name of it. And it'll be an async function. So I'll just use an arrow function a bit like this. Oops, got the async in the wrong place there. And just having the async keyword in there will just allow us to use the await keyword, just so we can neaten up our code, because all of these functions within MongoDB are promise-based, so this will just help to keep everything in a certain order. So we'll say we'll await for the client to connect. So we'll call this connect function on the client, which will be taking the URL, making an actual connection in very much in the same way that we did on the CLI yesterday. And if that's all good, we'll just say connected to server, which should be all we need to have there. And we'll also then just select the database. So the database from the client.db with the DB name, which is what we created above here, the project name. And if you saw the tutorial yesterday, we inserted a document into a collection, which is kind of like what a table is in MongoDB, into that collection for URLs. So that's what we're going to be using within our code here to reference the URLs that we're generating. So we'll say db.collection, and we'll just specify URLs. So we're going to do something with this code in the following tutorial, but we just want to actually make the database connection at the moment and just make sure that's all working okay. So from that connect to database function, we actually need to call it, because otherwise that won't do anything, it'll just sit there. So we'll call the function here before we initialize our Express application. And with that created, it does actually return a promise because it's an async function. So we can access its then block. So if there are any output from that function, we can just log it. If there's any errors, we can say console.error, and it'll pass those errors across. And when we're ready to finish here, we can just say make sure that the client dot close, and that'll just close the connection so that there's no loose connections running if the process doesn't finish. So what we've done here is we've created some configuration for our MongoDB connection, and then we've actually created a function which will do the connection, and then we're actually calling that function to make sure the connection goes ahead. So on the command line, if it's not running already, we can actually build and run our project. So if you remember, using the NX tooling, we use the command NX run and then the project name. So it's rickandroll is the name of the API. And then we just say serve with a colon after it and let that run. And if we just open up our terminal a little bit so you can see what's happened, you can see here, once this code has run here, you can see the server is listening still on this port and endpoint, and also we've got this connected to server, and that's a really bad name. We should have said connected to database server maybe, just so it's clear what we're actually connecting to. But you can see that's been successful. There's no errors. We haven't got any output to suggest that there's a problem. So we're now connected to our MongoDB database from our code. So with that set up, what we can do in our following tutorials is actually make some calls to the Mongo database server by inserting some data into it, much like we did on the command line. And then following on from that, we can actually retrieve data later on as well. So that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.